Welcome, listener. This is Sebastian Nothwell interviewing E.H. Lupton, author of Dionysus in Wisconsin. Hello!
Hi.
Now, which of your books are you most excited to talk about today, and why?
Oh gosh. So the book is the third book in my series, which is Troth. So I guess I'm here to talk about that. It's like talk about the new stuff, but I'm going to have to talk about the other two also just as a sort of like, here is the background. It's like that sort of series where you really want to read all of the books. I mean, obviously I want you to read all the books anyway, but there's like important background.
This is the kind of series that is following the same characters in a specific sequence and not disparate characters centered around a central theme.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is your series about?
Wisconsin in the late 1960s, plus gods and magic.
One of the gods being Dionysus, given the title of the first book.
Yes. He seems like a real, he fits really well with the 60s.
Oh, absolutely.
But also Wisconsin at the time, obviously, this is a really interesting time to be podcasting because a lot of people are sort of looking at the upper Midwest and being like, wow, it's super weird up there. Which it continues to be. I mean, it will continue to be. But in the 60s, Madison was really this hotbed of political upset. There was a very strong anti-war movement. And at one point in August of 1970, they blew up a building.
Oh dear.
Yes. It's a really interesting historical event in that it becomes kind of a black hole. It's hard to find information about that particular building before that event. Because if you search, everything is just Sterling Hall explosion, Sterling Hall bombing. But I think that maybe people outside of Wisconsin don't know about that history. But I think that kind of people clashing with the police and this, that also fits somehow into something about Dionysus. Feelings I have about him as an outsider, or somebody whose rituals can take place in a non-temple, non-sanctioned context, I think.
Kind of out in the wilderness, the church is wherever you decide to be.
Yeah, that you might be out in the woods with your friends, getting high, and then suddenly you enter a sacred mood and you rip apart a deer with your bare hands or something.
Exactly.
As one does. Yeah, but there seemed to be something that matched up about those ideas when I was sort of, kicking over rocks to see if there were ideas under them, I guess.
Absolutely. Kind of that veneer of a fun time party guy over a core of chaos.
Yes, that's a really great way to put it.
And also, like a lot of figures in ancient Greek mythology, Dionysus is a rather queer figure, which I'm guessing fits well in the urban fantasy queer historical fiction of your stories.
He is. And, I really appreciate that aspect. And sometimes I think, actually, in certain respects, these are very traditional. Is that weird to say, these are very traditional queer romances?
There is a long, proud tradition of queer romance throughout the centuries.
Yes.
That ebbs and flows as society permits, but it's always there.
Yes. I would say that, the two main characters are cis men. And they play sometimes with ideas about gender and, do we map this character to, can we map this male character to Ariadne or something like that? Ariadne, for those who haven't spent the last 4 years deeply engrossed in Greek mythology, was Dionysus's wife, to whom he was very loyal, which was something that I appreciated about him as a god.
I was gonna say, that's a very uncommon trait amongst that pantheon.
It really is, which I think made him a very interesting character also for me. I know that there's a big love, I guess, on the internet of Hades and Persephone. People want to reinterpret their story. But I do find that something about Dionysus and Ariadne was really interesting for me. But, obviously, both of the characters are cis men. I think there would have been a really interesting rewrite to write the whole thing with one of the main characters as a trans man instead. But, maybe in 10 years when I'm a much better writer. But
The alternate edition.
The alternate edition, yeah.
I mean, that does kind of fit in with mythology because we have so many versions of these stories being told and retold throughout the years.
We do. And it's interesting, the way that, people circle around themes and they come back to them and re-examine them. We see the same thing in, writers today who will be, circling around the same themes over and over again. and coming back to things. You don't have to read maybe too many Stephen King books before you start being like, drugs and Christianity and personal responsibility and...
This guy has a lot of feelings about writing and addiction.
Yes. And like, I don't know why we would expect mythology to be different, except like maybe it reflects a broader set of thoughts about the way the world is.
Absolutely. Speaking of the global tradition of storytelling, what drives your storytelling?
I started this project in like 2022. I was going through a very rough patch personally, and I was super stressed out. There's like kid health issues going on. So I felt like I was going to turn into a diamond or something, and I needed a pressure release valve. And I'd been working on some books that are not currently published, but maybe someday, set in London in the 1880s. I was like talking to my friend. I said, what if I wrote something that was set in Wisconsin? Because, London is a really cool place, but it feels like a fantasy world, I guess. Like the London of the 1880s that I know is like from Sherlock Holmes, like it feels a little bit fictional.
A little bit removed from our own reality, much in the same way as Narnia.
Yes, which is like what's brilliant about it, right, as a writer. But I felt like kind of weird as a person living in Wisconsin who's been to London once to just be like, hi, I wrote these books set in London. But, it wasn't like I could travel there to do in-person research at the time. It was like, I live in Madison. I could write about, the people that I know, kind of. I don't want to write about the 1880s in Wisconsin because it was kind of the Wild West.
I was gonna say, I feel like Laura Ingalls Wilder already covered that.
There's this thing about like you give characters props and then you have to like keep track of them. And then if somebody has a horse, that's like a whole thing that you're adding into the story, I feel like.
That's a car that can walk away from you.
Yes. So, but then like the 60s were really neat. It's a period that I grew up hearing a lot about. Like that was when my mom was really in college, starting medical school. Like, so it felt accessible or familiar, but also like I don't have to think about what's going on right now. Like I can just live in 1969 and avoid my problems. And like since then, I want to be like clear. A lot of things have changed. Like the kid is doing very well. I'm a lot less stressed out because of that. But I really enjoy historical fiction, it turns out. So that is where I have stayed.
And it's also an area of historical fiction that sees a lot less attention, I feel.
Yeah, it does. I think I had read probably Cat Sebastian's Cabot stories, especially Peter Cabot Gets Lost, which is, I think, set in 1960. And that might have been like the most recent historical that I had read at the time. But it did feel a lot like giving me a little bit of permission to set something after World War II.
Yes.
And, it's weird a little bit to be writing about a time that people that I know remember. One time I did a reading and a guy came up to me afterwards and was like, that bar that you mentioned, we used to go drinking there. And I had this moment of like, I thought I made that one up. Like, I thought I took some real names and I took some fake names and I thought that was a fake one. Oh my God.
Well.
Yeah. Cool. So stuff like that happens more than I would think. But also sometimes like my husband's biological mother's boyfriend who served in Vietnam and, around Madison in the late 60s was like, I think you got it almost right. And I was like, that is a compliment, sir.
That's the best praise you can get.
Yes, I will take it.
Do you have a favorite character that you've created?
Oh no. I've been dreading this question.
Every time I ask this, it seems like the hardest one out of the whole interview.
It really is. Because, I think as a writer, in order to write good characters, you have to kind of fall in love with all of them. Like, even the villains, even the people who are shitty to each other. I love so many things about them. So, obviously, Sam and Ulysses are, the main characters of the first 3 books. And Sam is an archivist, and later he works in the rare books section of Memorial Library, which is an actual library here on the UW-Madison campus that I worked in when I was a library student. And Ulysses is a grad student, and then later he finishes his PhD and he sort of becomes like an early career professor. And I think that there's so much about both of them that I really love. And I like the way that they relate to each other, and I like the way they talk about their problems. But really, like, for me, the standout in the third book is Ulysses' younger brother, Lazarus, or Laz. He's just come back from serving in the Vietnam War. You know, he was in the Air Force. He has a little soupçon of PTSD going on, which was not well understood at the time. You know, he doesn't really quite get what's going on, but he has some problems. He missed a lot of stuff that happened while he was gone for 10 years for college and then serving in the Air Force. Like, he and Ulysses were very close, and then he missed a lot of things in Ulysses' life, including Ulysses meeting Sam. So he's having like a rough time readjusting. And as a writer, whenever you're like, oh, this character is having such a rough time, how can I make it worse?
Yes.
You know? But like that sort of pathetic baby girl quality, I think, as the kids would say.
As the youth permit.
Yes. It's fun for me to trace his arc sort of in the background of this one, like the way that other characters react to his problems. And, you know, the things that we see and like things that we maybe assume happen, but we don't see them. Actually, like the next book, which will be out, I don't know when, 9 months from now, maybe, is him as a main character. So I actually wrote that one before I wrote the one that's coming out now, just so I could get a really good handle on his problems. But yeah, I like characters who are smart and driven, and then they just have like this one gaping hole that they have to figure out how to take a running jump over, you know?
Absolutely, yes. What stories inspire you?
I read a fair amount of genre fiction that kind of masquerades as literature, I guess I would say. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu, A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine. Like things that have a lot of plot, but also the language is really beautiful and really important. Right before I started these books, I had been writing a lot of poetry. And I think one thing that I learned from that was the way that every word in a sentence can be really important and chosen really precisely. And I really appreciate books that do that.
The Name of the Rose in particular, it's such a well-researched work of historical fiction, but also such a perfectly plotted mystery.
Yes, it's got so much history stuff. And if you buy the footnote books, you can learn more about heresy than you probably ever wanted to know.
What's the number one thing you want readers to take away from your books?
Oh God. A really deep appreciation for men's fashion.
Yes.
Because sometimes people read these books. My husband in particular will read and be like, I don't necessarily care about what type of suit somebody is wearing. I'm like, well, I do. I care a lot about suits, apparently.
I wrote this book so I could write about suits.
Yes. And we're not going to talk about like how many times I've Googled like what type of underwear did people wear in 1970.
I mean, that's a universal constant with historical fiction authors, I feel.
Yes, it's amazing. And the 70s are recent enough that you can get advertising, which is just like so perfect. I recommend if you're bored, maybe, what is it, incognito mode? But Google like 1970s underwear ads. Just do it. But, you know, like one of the interesting things about writing things that are set in a queer normative space is that because we're reading them in our world, like, I don't know, maybe the specter of homophobia still exists for the reader in a certain sense. So we can talk about a character's journey to self-acceptance in a non like, oh my God, I feel weird about the fact that I'm gay. And then, but like without having to talk about it that way. Like we can talk about instead, like I'm coming to terms with the fact that I'm also kind of a god or something like that. But I think that the overall theme of self-acceptance as a journey is like something that's valuable, and ideas like you can find joy in your life at sort of as a work in progress while you're still coming to terms with things, or you can find a way to act even if you don't have perfect information. You can ethically like do the best thing that you can. I feel like these feel like very highfalutin themes. Like the books are really very funny and like kind of a little bit of horror mixed in, a little bit of comedy. It's not like a lecture from your least favorite English professor. I just want to make that clear.
I mean, it is those genre conventions and that touch of horror and that touch of comedy that makes it possible to access higher themes, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a nice portal into those larger themes.
Yeah, it's a lever. You know, maybe something you can use to nod and wink and be like, yes, we are talking about magic, but maybe there is a lesson that you can take with you, you know?
What are some themes that you love to explore or revisit in your writing?
I mean, like, I think it's kind of a given for romance to have like themes of joy and love and self-acceptance. Ideas of like, how do you learn to be in a relationship? I think I wind up talking about that a little bit because that's one of the interesting parts of writing about the same couple for like several books. Like in the end, Sam and Ulysses will be the main characters for 4 books. So we get to watch them learn how to be in a relationship together and like how to figure out what they need out of that relationship and like where is this going and, you know, learning to deal with their pasts and their families. So like I think that that sort of thing comes up a lot. This is funny because, like, you never see these themes in your work, and then somebody will point it out, and you'll be like, oh, yeah. So I say I've been told that I write a lot about, like, sort of dysfunctional families. Not necessarily dysfunctional in the sense of, like, where people actually hate each other, but dysfunctional in this sort of way of, like, we're just not speaking the same language exactly, or people just want things that are not compatible with each other, or, you know, Sam's relationship with his family of origin is pretty dodgy at best because of the ways that they try to protect him. And, you know, when you fall in love with the characters, like, I sympathize with his father, especially for having wanted to protect him. He just had a really crummy way of doing it, right? And like, you also have to look at that from Sam's point of view and be like, yeah, I get why he doesn't really want to talk to Howard probably ever again. But like these ways that sometimes when you are in a dysfunctional family and you learn to like what boundaries you can put in place, how you can deal with them, I guess. I seem to come back to that a lot.
Kind of learning how to make an imperfect machine still run.
Yeah. Which, you know, I get the feeling that it's something that a lot of people just wind up dealing with when they get to be adults. Partially, like, you just live in a different world than your parents lived in, and you have to figure out how to talk to them. And it's like you're speaking 2 slightly different languages sometimes. I think that's even true of, like, people who had really good parents. But also, when you talk to a lot of people, having really good parents doesn't feel like it's that common.
Not necessarily, no. Particularly not in the queer community.
Yes.
We're all addicted to found family for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, how do you balance the need to sometimes stay in contact with your family, but also like needing to have a boundary between yourself and them?
What drew you to your subgenre?
Specifically, at the time, I had been getting into queer historical romance. I want to say that Bridgerton had sort of come out, and I was reading those books. And, you know, like they were fine. I am not super impressed by like their historicalism. I don't know how to. They don't feel like super in-depth historical or whatever. But somehow I got from that to queer historical romance. And at some point I stumbled onto like KJ Charles's Magpie books, which was really exciting because they had magic in them. And like not just magic, but like a different way of looking at magic. Like that was sort of, I think when I realized that I was like, oh, I don't like hate fantasy. I find high fantasy kind of tiring, but like urban fantasy is great. And I say that like at the same time that I was reading these books, I was like reading Lord of the Rings aloud to my, gosh, he was like 4 years old at the time. Which is a time commitment. let me tell you, that was like 11 months to read that book aloud.
But it's 11 months when you don't have to think of a different book to read each night. You know exactly what you're getting into.
That's true. And then every time we go to the kindergarten and his teacher is like, "Can you guess which of the pictures your child drew?" And it's like the one that has, like, it's holding four swords. And we're like, okay, we did this. This was us.
This is what we've created.
We delved too deep. I don't know. But like, you know, like I love Tolkien, but then I love Terry Pratchett. And I hadn't really put together like Terry Pratchett is urban fantasy. Like he's a very specific thing. He's hard to replicate. But like other high fantasy tends to be like a lot of very straight male characters in a way that didn't really appeal too much to me. But so like queer urban fantasy was awesome. And from there, I jumped and I started reading Jordan Hawkes' Widdershins series, which is excellent and like subverting all of these horror themes. And like the librarians were amazing. And the let's do library research in the middle of a book. Like that was really cool. But also, I had noticed that like now suddenly I'm reading indie writers. And it felt like something that was accessible to me in a way that, like, reading The Name of the Rose really isn't, right?
Less so, some might say.
Yes, yes.
If you enjoy KJ Charles and Jordan Hawk, have you looked into Death by Silver at all?
You know, it's really funny because I was up for this Midwest Book Award in fantasy, actually, and that book was also nominated. And we both lost to, like, the more traditional fantasy sci-fi novel, which was disappointing. But yeah, it's really fun. And I'm not all the way through it yet, so don't tell me how it ends. But I met the publisher at WisCon, in 2023, I think.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, she's a Minnesota person, so she's, you know, kind of local.
Nice. What advice do you have for aspiring authors?
Gosh. Okay. So the biggest thing anybody ever told me was read, 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 read. And I'm going to amend that to say, like, not just read in your genre, but like, if you want to be a traditionally published writer, you know, read traditionally published writers in your genre. If you want to be an indie writer, read other indie writers who are working in your genre, because you are basically proposing yourself to be in that peer group, sort of. And so, like, if somebody comes up to you and says, like, hey, recommend me another indie writer, and you say, oh, I don't really read indies except for, like, this one that I wrote. I don't know, that doesn't feel great. That doesn't feel, like, community-oriented or anything like that.
It's what the youth call not a great look.
Yeah, it's like, if you won't read other indies, like, how do you know how you fit in? How do you know what people are expecting?
Do you even know what you're responding to creatively, or
Yeah.
are you responding to assumptions that may or may not exist outside of your own head?
Yeah, and one thing that I really liked about watching poets is the way that they all kind of talk about and respond to each other's work. They can be a little bit catty, but they can also be like really supportive. And like, I watched poet, you know, go into a new city and find somebody that they knew and do a reading together, like that kind of encouragement. And for me, I didn't have like the most traditional path of like study creative writing and then you get an MFA. Like I didn't do that. So I didn't have like that peer group coming out of school of like other writers. So like the people who are going to help you the most, the people who are going to tell you things about like not just like how do I make my writing better. I'm not going to say that's easy to learn, but like that is the thing that you can figure out. But like if you want to publish a book, there's like how do I find a good editor? How do I find a good cover artist? Or like if I don't find a cover artist, like how do I do a cover? How do you typeset a book? You know, like there's all of these nitty-gritty, and like really the people who are going to be your community, who are going to help you with that, are other writers who have done it before. And like involving yourself in the community by reading their books is like if you go up to a writer and you say, I read your book and I loved it, they'll be your best friend. I mean, I will anyway.
We really are kind of pushovers in that regard. It doesn't take much.
Oh, yeah. I'm so easy. But, you know, like people like to help. And if you give them any excuse, I think they will, basically. I will. Like, I like to answer people's questions about, oh, how do I put out an ebook? Well, I like, here's a blog post that I wrote about it. Here's this. And these are lessons that I learned. And like, here's the name of the program that I use for changing my file formats from this to that. And, just because with the first book, I had so many headaches on the publishing side of things because I thought, I've written a book. I want to publish it. I did not realize that like publishing a book is taking on a whole different hobby than writing a book.
Yes.
So I learned I learned so many things like on the fly up until like, 2 nights before it's supposed to go live. And I'm trying to finish the paperback and like it's in RGB or something and it needs to be in CMYK. I don't even 100% understand at this point what that means. Just that my program won't do it. And like having this panic attack at like 11 o'clock at night. You know what I mean? And then,
yeah.
So it's the sort of hand holding that I would have wished that if I had had more of a community at that point that I could be like, guys, what do I do? Help, like somebody.
Someone knows this.
Yes.
And yeah, I would say indie authors on the whole are much freer with resources than we may at first appear.
Mm-hmm. There's like a lot of Discord spaces where writers will congregate to get together. Facebook groups, there's people talking I'm on Mastodon, I guess. So there's like lots of people who want to talk about writing on Mastodon and most of them are indie writers. So whatever you want, like, hey guys, could you just workshop this blurb for me for like 5 minutes? Or just like somebody look at this cover and tell me it looks pretty so I don't lose my mind. Like there's always somebody around and willing to like help you out if you know where to look.
Absolutely. So if people have been intrigued by what you've said here today, where can they catch up with you and your work?
Yeah, my website is ehlupton.com. And you can find links to all my books there. They're all widely available. But you can find all the links if you just go to my website. And there's also a blog there. There's, my really weird, like 10 years long running journal comic that is occasionally updated. Links to my podcast, probably other stuff that I'm forgetting about.
And this is all available at ehlupton.com.
Yeah. Oh, there's a free short story there, actually. If you go and look at like the extras page, there is a short story about, it's like a cafe alternative universe of Dionysus in Wisconsin.
What kids these days call a coffee shop AU?
Yes, where the magic is replaced with references to philosophy, and also it has an annotated bibliography, which I'm sorry about in advance if you happen to be like, I read that paper by Spivak and I don't agree with your interpretation at all. Like, I'm really sorry. But it's free, and, if you want to get a taste of my writing for free, it's called Deuce, which was a title that 100% made sense when I picked it, and nobody stopped me, like most things.
That's the other side of the coin of being indie authors, that no one stops us.
Yes. Well, okay, so like sometimes originally Dionysus in Wisconsin was going to be called How to Become a God, and everybody was like, don't call it that, please. And so it wound up being called Dionysus in Wisconsin. But then I went to name the second book, and I called it Old Time Religion after the song by Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie, which, the Old Time Religion was like a hymn, I want to say. But they wrote these somewhat parody verses where they talk about, I will pray to Aphrodite, whatever. And I thought that was really funny. And then like later on, I had somebody who was asking me about the books who was like, oh, I'm not religious. And I was like, oh, it's not that kind of religion.
It's an older old-time religion.
Yes, like a lot of the mythology in the second book is like old Welsh mythology that comes up in the Mabinogi, which, dates from 1200s or so. So old-ish, I guess. I don't know. It depends. Like if you've been doing a podcast about the Middle Ages for 4 years, 1200s doesn't seem that old anymore, but for normal people, it is.
As compared to Dionysus, it's basically yesterday.
Yes, exactly. But like people kind of were like, okay, that seems like a title that a book could have. Like nobody stopped me. And then with Troth, like somebody suggested it and I was like, oh yes, that's perfect. Because it means like a promise. Right. In Shakespeare, we sometimes have like somebody say they plight their troth, like they make a promise. So like thematically, it felt like a very good word. But also, I'm aware that like people keep coming up and being like, what does it mean? I'm like, well, there you go.
This is an opportunity for education.
Yes. There's so many things with Miar. And then, like, the short story Deuce got its name because it's a Haitian Creole word that means, like, sweetness or sweet. And one of the characters uses it as a term of endearment for his wife in the second book. And then they're the two people who own the cafe. So I was like, of course they're going to call it that, without being like, that's a word that no English speaker is going to look at and be like, yes, I totally understand where that is coming from. But, you know.
Room to grow, room to learn.
Yes. You play things where they lie, I think. Maybe that's my overall philosophy is like, we're just going to go with it.
Well, thank you so much for calling me on the pod. It's been a delight to chat with you.
Yeah, this has been great.
And look forward to hearing more from you soon.